stories. So it's my pleasure to introduce Massachusetts author, co-author of 24 books, and a great library friend. And I hope you enjoy Michael's talk about recurring wonderful stories of survival and what the human being is capable of.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see a great turnout, gives me energy, and I'm going to take you through this survival story of the Bounty. And many of you are probably asking why? Why was the ship out there when the hurricane was so well forecast? So I'll try and answer that and give you some insight into the decisions that were made. And basically the program follows the book. It's a three-part. We introduce you to the crew and the vessel. A woman earlier told me, talk a little bit about the Bounty because my teenagers don't know anything. They think it's a new ship. And I'll tell you a little bit about the Bounty itself, and then the journey, and then the rescue. And before I get started, this is a sign-up sheet. I do a newsletter every 6 months. So feel free to print your email. I only do it 6 months. And I'll mention in there how I did try out for the movie, and they politely told me to stick to writing. It's so different to try and memorize other people's lines. You know, when you're not talking as yourself, it's a whole different ballgame. Because my son tried out too, and he came home, and I said, how'd you do? And he said, not good. And I said, what happened? He said, I couldn't remember the lines. And I'm like, you only had one line. He goes, Dad, it's different. I go, I'll show you. And I go, the same thing happened. I did an interview with the Boston Globe, and they called me the master of disaster writing. And I was like, I don't want to be known that way, because my last 3 books have been very different. One returns to when I started out as a writer. It was about the outdoors and history and hidden places. So I just did a book with a co-author, Inns and Adventures, and it's about off the beaten track places in Vermont and New Hampshire. And then I did one called Derek's Gift, and this is an inspirational true story about a Massachusetts teenager. And then getting back to the roots of a little bit of humor, my daughter and I did a book called The Cringe Chronicles, Mortifying Misadventures with My Dad. And Kristen was the lead writer. It's about her growing up with an eccentric father, me. And, you know, she's writing about the vacations from hell and how I almost got her eaten by a shark. And so she's sending me these chapters. Kristen's now 27 years old and works in New York City, but she's writing about her teenage years. So as she sends me the rough drafts, I'm cracking up, but then I'd email her back going, wait a minute, you're putting all the blame on me for this. So she came up with the perfect solution for the book. She said, how about at the end of each chapter, I give you 2 pages for something called a dad's view. And so you get 2 very different perspectives on the same event, and you kind of get this point-counterpoint. So that was a fun thing to do. Because I think if you only do books about survival and disaster, you become too serious. And it's fun to mix it up a little bit. So I don't know if we can dim the lights a little bit, because this is going to be a visual, kind of like you're watching a movie. I will find a place to stand out of your way, maybe over on this side. And then at the end, we'll take a couple questions and do a book signing, and I'll be staying around for more questions. So Doug Campbell was the co-author on this book. I write my stories, like Rescue of the Bounty, for the general public. But Doug was a much more experienced sailor than I am. He single-handedly sailed to Bermuda. And so he added a wealth of new information. But we had made the agreement we were still targeting the book for a broad audience. You don't have to own a boat or have ever been in a boat to understand what's happening. So this was the replica of the original HMS Bounty, and this is the ship we're going to be following. It was built in 1960 for the movie with Marlon Brando. And a lot of people say, oh, it was nothing but a movie prop, you know, built for the movie, but it was built by craftsmen in Nova Scotia. And they actually sailed it all the way from Nova Scotia to Tahiti. So the boat could sail, and it continued to sail. But keep in mind, it was built in 1960, and it's made out of wood. So 50 years old, a lot of maintenance had to go into that vessel. And central to the story is the captain, Robin Walbridge. So we get into his background quite a bit, and we interviewed all sorts of people that have crewed with him in the past. And by and large, people said he was a great captain to be with, that very good teacher, a real problem solver, could fix anything with his hands. And you know, we got a few dissenting votes from some past crew members, and one said, we were coming from the Caribbean to Bermuda, and as soon as we got to Bermuda, I ran off the boat, I didn't walk. And when I interviewed him, he said, because I thought we went through some weather we should not have gone through. So it wasn't unanimous about him, but by and large, and without exception, the crew that was with him during the accident had good things to say. And the crew was typically, not all, but most of them were young, like Adam Prokash here. And it was a crew of 15 plus the captain, so a total of 16. Most were young. Doug and I decided let's focus on about 6 or 7 of the people so we don't lose the reader. And Adam was one of those folks. And they were doing it for the love of the sea. They only made $100 a week being a crew member, and they just wanted to learn all they could about tall ships. Claudine Christian was 42 years old, and she traced her lineage back to Fletcher Christian. So when she had a period in her life where she had time, she decided what better vessel to sail on than the Bounty. So Claudine was new to the Bounty during the summer of 2012. So the story starts way at the top of the map up in Maine in Booth Bay Harbor, because that's where the Bounty was when they were undergoing repairs. And the main thing that was going on in Booth Bay was they were recaulking the planks in the hull. And while they were in that process, the crew was doing most of the work, but they were supervised by shipwrights. One of the carpenters pointed out there was rot in some of the structural timbers. And so I was actually up in Booth Bay last summer speaking, and there was a gentleman in the audience, and he said, you said there was rot in the timbers. He said it was actually woodworms. He said, I worked on the ship, and he brought a piece of it. And I've never seen this phenomena of woodworms before, but it looked like somebody took a drill, you know, went right through the wood in a straight line. And I said, did you tell the captain? And he said, oh yes, they were aware of it, but they didn't have the time or the funds to do such a major overhaul. So we said, you better address this next year because it's gotta be fixed. So they left Booth Bay, they came down through Massachusetts. Probably some of you in the audience might have seen it when it stopped in Plymouth, and then it went on to New London. And while it was in New London is when this map was available of this potential hurricane that would be called Sandy. And as you see, the projected path actually was pretty darn accurate to what really happened. And I'm not always that kind with the National Weather Service. I did a book called Fatal Forecast, so you can understand my view on that book, where they had a weather buoy that was malfunctioning, and it was spitting back all this incorrect data, but they never told the mariners. So they think we've got the same usual forecast as in the past, and they leave from Hyannis, and they go right into a 100-foot rogue wave. Now, that's Fatal Forecast, where in this story, the Weather Service did a remarkable job. So if the captain had this map, why would he leave knowing it's heading his way up in New London? And he talked it over with his first mate, John Svensson, that you see in this photo. And John testified that he told the captain, I think we ought to stay right here. We're safe, we're at New London, or we could even go to Boston, could even go to the Hudson River in New York. And Robin, the captain, Robin Walbridge, who'd been captain for at least 10 years off the top of my head, said, no, I still think we need to go. We're not going to go into the hurricane, obviously. We're going to make our way south, get more up-to-date weather forecasts, then make a decision how to get around it. And part of his motivation, you read in the book, is their destination was St. Petersburg, Florida, where they had an event planned that potentially could have been really important to the future of the Bounty, because they were always in a scramble. How do we raise funds to keep this wooden boat afloat? And in the audience, there's a couple volunteers that work on the rescue boat that Bernie Weber was on in the finest hours of 36,500, and they can attest a wooden boat, needs constant maintenance. So he had that event in the back of his head, and that's never a good thing to have a schedule when you're doing, not just at sea, just anything that has a risk. So he says to John, okay, so you're telling me some of the crew are hearing about this hurricane. Why don't I call them together and I'll talk to them? And that's what he does. So this is where the story really starts ramping up. So this is a Thursday night, and the accident happens on Monday. So we follow that 5-day period. So he calls the people together, his crew together, and he says, I've gone out in bad weather before. We're not going to go into the hurricane. We're going to go around it. But I want you to know, if anybody wants to get off the ship, there's no hard feelings, and you can meet us in St. Petersburg. And he says, think about it. And they do. And to a person of this 15-person crew, they all agree, no, we're with you. We want to go. And, it is starting to form up, this tropical storm, and turn into a hurricane. And it turned into a very unusual hurricane. Not the strongest by any means. There have been much stronger hurricanes. But in terms of its breadth, there'd never been a storm like this. Over 900 miles across. And nobody knew that was coming on Thursday, but they had some indications it might be bigger than the usual storm. So when everybody says, we're with you, Rob, and he says, okay, you know what to do, get to work, we're leaving in 2 hours. So they left that evening on Thursday, and people in New London who we talked to, they said, when the ship was going out, we thought maybe they were going down to New York City, into a safe harbor. We had no idea they were going to go out around Montauk and then head to the southeast. So it came as a surprise to a number of people. And so, again, the slide presentation kind of follows the book where we set the tone in the beginning, and then the voyage itself is going very well. That Thursday night, they had good sailing, good time. Friday was another good day. And when they didn't have strong enough winds, the Bounty did have a propeller, and so they had engine power and they could speed up. And they're getting the latest weather forecasts and seeing what this storm is going to do. And it's really on Saturday that their hand is forced. You never want to see a wave like this. I experienced my first really bad seas this winter fishing off Florida, and it was nothing like this, because when you see a wave this steep, it's eventually going to break. It can't support itself, and those are the dangerous ones. If it's just a big swell, you can get up and over it. You might be seasick, but you'll survive. But they're starting to get hit by waves like this, and he's got the latest weather forecast, and it says basically the projection we made on Thursday is accurate. It's coming right at him. So now he's got to make a decision which way to go. And in our research, we never really uncovered a decision or an option to go maybe east of Bermuda or due west into the Chesapeake. The decision was made, we're going to go to the southwest. And in an email he sent back to his home base, he said, we're heading to the southwest, and we, by all indications, it looks like we'll be able to squeak by Sandy. And so this kind of gives you the timeline, so you can see on the 27th, they've got to make that move. If they continue on the path they're going on, they'll go right into the hurricane. Now, by going to the southwest, it does create one additional problem, and that's they're heading towards the Gulf Stream. And I've done 3 books that the Gulf Stream is kind of the villain, if you will. So I worked with Dane and Jennifer Clark, who are the premier Gulf Stream experts. And one of the big problems is it's flowing to the northeast. If you have a low pressure system, it's coming around like this, now the wind generated waves are colliding with the current, and what that does is make them steep. So you might have a 10-foot sea outside of the Gulf Stream, but in it could grow to 20 feet. And then another thing that was new to me was I didn't know that it had all these little cold water and warm water eddies coming off it, like these tentacles, and they can actually detach from the Gulf Stream, and you'll have moving current, and you think you're not in the Gulf Stream, but you're in a place almost as bad because you've got moving water to make the waves steeper. The first injury happens to Robin, of all people. He's in this room. This is the great room. And like so many of these stories I research, it's one wave coming from a little different angle or maybe a little bit bigger wave. You're not prepared for it and you fall. Well, he fell into the fixed table here at the stern of the ship and injured his back. But by now, as you get into Saturday night, you've got so much happening on board the ship, all hands are needed. And I often thought that the 16 is kind of like a bare bones crew to be going into bad weather. So even though he's injured, he's got to continue working, and the big thing they're working on is the pumps. They're operating, but they're not operating at 100%. So you've got water coming in, it's a wooden ship, some's coming in through the caulking they just repaired, some's coming down through the deck and pouring rain as well, accumulating down in the bilge, and the pumps aren't keeping up with it. Now they're worried about losing power. And as Saturday gets into Sunday, you're getting power surges, you're getting sparks that are coming out of some fixtures, and even though they're taking apart the pumps, nothing's working. They did have a little emergency pump, and it was brand new, still in the shrink-wrapped packaging, and they couldn't get that started. So they got a lot going on. And up on the deck, it's really dangerous because, if you get a wave that breaks and sweeps over the deck, it's going to take you right off unless you're clipped in. Even if you're clipped in, it's not good. But occasionally, a sail or part of a sail would become unfurled, and people would actually have to go up in the rigging during the storm. And from all accounts, the crew performed great. There was no panic as things are getting more and more dire, and they're still performing at a team. But they were exhausted. They've been up now because this bad weather is keeping them awake. Even if you tried to lie down, one crew member said, there was water dripping right on my head in the bunk. There's no way you could rest. You were taking such a beating. And so at first, and I think Robin might have been in a little bit of denial when a couple of the senior crew members say, we should let the Coast Guard know, we're not in a Mayday, but let them know our situation and what's going on. He at first says, no, I think our time is better served solving the problem. We want to get past this hurricane and get to the southwest. But without that engine working, and you can't put up sails in a hurricane, they're kind of sitting ducks. And eventually even he realizes, yeah, we better do that. So he does it via email and says, here's our position, taking on water, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, we should be okay until morning. This is now Sunday evening at about 6 p.m. We should be okay till morning. And he says, outside of the pumps, the vessel's handling good. And when the Coast Guard gets the email, they're wondering, now, is this a distress? Are they just alerting us? Is he downplaying how bad it is? Because they're hearing all these weather reports of the hurricane. So they had a huge decision to make. Do we launch a search plane? And the reason they would want to launch a search plane is even though there's no rescue, they want to make direct radio communication with the people on board, not do it through email, knowing they're probably going to lose email, which they did. So they want direct communication. How bad is this? What's the status? But in a kind of a change from, say, today's Coast Guard to the finest hours back in 1952, back then, when they sent Bernie Weber out, it was you go, and that's it. And they're not calculating, can we get our people back? Today's Coast Guard is so much smarter. They do a whole risk assessment. They even have it color-coded. And I thought their solution here was really a good one. They said, let's launch the C-130, but we'll leave it up to the aircraft commander to make the call. How close can you get to the hurricane and to the Bounty? But if you think you're in the red zone, the red danger zone, you're to make the call to abort the mission. Now, there's nothing we can do. And so the commander of the C-130, his name was Wes McIntosh, and he was really instrumental to do the book. Oftentimes that all the glory goes to the helicopter crews, but boy, without the C-130s going first, a lot of these rescues that I researched would have never happened. So now you're into Sunday night, and the crew's given up trying to fix the pump. No matter what they do, they're not going to get it to 100%. Nobody ever found out 100% why it wasn't operating correctly. But they've got in survival suits. So the Bounty had all the latest safety equipment. It does have the emergency beacon called the EPIRB. You can activate that, and the Coast Guard will eventually, not right away, but eventually know where you are. And so they'd be sitting on this starboard deck area here with their backs up against the rail, all in survival suits, with the plan that if this keeps up, if water keeps coming in, we'll probably have to abandon ship in the morning, but we want to do it when it's light outside, which made perfect sense. It'd be so hard to abandon ship at night in an orderly way. So they're just kind of waiting it out. And some of the more senior crew, they're not verbalizing this, but they're watching all this rigging above them going, if we go over, it's miles and miles of line in the water to get tangled in, and the masts and everything else, and they're thinking that would be the absolute worst. And again, there's different experience levels on board, and again, no panic, they're just kind of waiting. So Wes kind of tells the story best. He says, so we did make radio communication with the Bounty. He said, they were very lucky, he said, because I almost aborted. And I said, why? And he said, just before we got to their position, a wind gust hit us so hard, he said, the C-130 shot up 300 feet. And then he said, when the gust passed, he said it dropped 200. And he said, I had on the night vision goggles, and he said he saw the wings flex 5 feet. And he said, I've never seen that before. And he said, just 5 minutes later, I got them on the radio. And it was John Svensson on the radio, the first mate, and he says, we're taking on water about a foot per hour. We still think we'll be okay to morning. We're in survival suits. And Wes goes, okay, we're going to stay with you through the night, but you won't be able to see us. He said, but whenever we come down to 500 feet, we're just getting hammered. He said, so we're going to be up at 2,000 feet doing figure eights above you and check in every 20, 25 minutes. And John goes, Roger, and there was one part you could hear a little desperation in his voice because he did say, are there any vessels in the vicinity that can come to our aid? And Wes had to be honest and go, negative. They were the only vessel out there. So Wes goes, so we do these figure eights, and the co-pilot would check in with them, and they'd give us the update, which is the same. And he said, say 3 a.m., 3:30 a.m., all of a sudden, abandoning ship, abandoning ship. This is over the radio, and he's in the cockpit at 2,000 feet, and he's like, oh my God. And he goes, Bounty, come in. What's happening? And nobody answers. And he's like, oh God. And he said, when we got below 500 feet with the night vision goggles, he said, this is what we saw. The whole ship was awash. And he said the tops of the masts had busted off. And in my interview with him, he said there were 30 blinking strobes in the water. And I said, you counted wrong. I said, there's only 16. And he said, I'm telling you, there were 30. So my guess is there were empty survival suits that had water-activated strobes, but there were extra strobes. And so he didn't know which ones had people in it, which ones didn't. And so he gets on the radio back to Elizabeth City, North Carolina. That's where the big air station is. And he goes, PIW, PIW, people in the water, people in the water. And the Coast Guard's got another tough decision. Do we launch a helicopter into a hurricane? We know this is desperate now, but they don't want to lose their helicopter crew. And, what happened when the first mate said abandoning ship is a wave hit the vessel. It's got a lot of water in it, sends it on its side. The water all goes that way, and the whole ship went on its side. But then it would start to rise up a little bit, and then the next wave would hit it, and boom, back down again. Some people were thrown into the water. Others were able to hang on, and Claudine was one who hung on to the ship. And being new, she said, what do I do, what do I do? And somebody shouted, go aft, crawl aft. That's where the big life raft is. Get away from the rigging and jump. You got to jump. And so she started moving aft. But there was a young man who was one of the central characters in the Rescue of the Bounty. His name was Josh Scornavacci. And he said, I was thrown off. And he said, I made the mistake of putting a safety harness over the survival suit I had on, and the safety harness got caught in the rigging, pulled me down 20 feet. He said, my ears popped, it held me there. I'm thinking, this is it. And then he said, it let me go. And he said, when I came up, there might be a picture, so imagine you're him down in the water. You're looking at the mass coming down, boom, and then coming up slowly, then the next wave, and you're trying to dodge all this stuff. And he said one time they came down right next to me, and they didn't come back up, so he said, I'll cling to the mast, which he did do, but he said then slowly it started going up. And these are his words. He said, a voice right next to me, as clear as day, said, you have to jump, it's your only chance. And he said, it couldn't have been another crew member. The wind was howling. There was nobody near me. He said, I'm totally convinced it was God. And he said, so I jumped. And he got away from the rigging, and he saw one blinking strobe, went to that, and it was a female crew member in the water, and they got together. And then the way he described it was, it's night, but he said you could see these strobes, so other people collected with us. And he said eventually 6 of us formed a group, and he didn't know this, but on the other side of the ship, 7 formed a group, which left 3 people on their own. And those 3 were Claudine, the first mate John Svensson and Captain Robin Walbridge. The other people had got in these two groups. And he said, then we found a life raft still in its canister, pulled the tether, the CO2, inflated it. And I was like, oh, that must have been the best sight in the world. What a relief to get in that. And he goes, not so fast. And he said we had trouble getting in. So these life raft advertisements always make it look so easy. But having done a lot of these interviews, it's never easy in big waves to get in that doorway. And what surprised me about this incident, I said, was it the waves that hindered you from getting in it? He said, no. He said, our survival suits let in enough water so that it all accumulated down at our legs, and each leg felt like it was 100 pounds. He said, so we had the lifeline. You could see the line around this raft. Their raft was much bigger. But he said we couldn't get in. I said, well, then what? He said, it took about 45 minutes of trying different techniques. We finally got the smallest person, and everybody pushing on their butt got that person in, and then he or she helped the next one, and the next one, and the next one. He said we finally got in. And the same situation was playing out on the other raft. Why? Now survival suits they'll let in a little water, but not that much. And I think the reason why is, remember, they're sitting up on the deck in their suits waiting for dawn to do the evacuation. They probably had it zipped to like here so they could still shout to each other because they've got hours to sit there, and didn't pull it the last inch, right to the bottom of your lip. And so it probably allowed just enough water for that to happen. So that was a big issue for almost the entire crew. So this was the part of the book that I really honed in on, was the rescue part, again, because I had done a lot of work with the people at Elizabeth City at the Coast Guard station there in the past. So it was kind of natural for me to flow right into this. And the big decision was, do we send out the Jayhawk? That's the bigger of the two helicopters they have. The Bounty is approximately 90 miles off Cape Hatteras, and it's on the edges of the storm. And they decided to do the same thing. We're going to leave it up to the captain or the commander, the aircraft commander of the Jayhawk, to see how far they can get. And so the book shifts focus here a little bit. Up to this point, it's all told from the survivors' perspective. Now it's told from the rescuers. So I'll introduce you. On the far left is Randy Haba. He's the rescue swimmer. Steve Cerveni is the aircraft commander. Jane Pena is the co-pilot. And Michael Lufkin is the mechanic, and also the one who's going to handle the hoist, the cable. And so I weave in the backgrounds where it's pertinent to this, but the one that was the most interesting to me was the aircraft commander, Steve Cerveni, because as I got to know him, he said, I was in a helicopter crash. I'm like, you're kidding. And he said he was coming back from British Columbia. He was the co-pilot. They had a freak snowstorm in the Rockies. The thing went down like a rock into timber. One person was severely injured, and he was also seriously injured and told, you'll be lucky if you ever walk again, let alone fly. And he said, a year of physical therapy, I got full use of my leg back and was able to fly again. And he said, so imagine I've just been recertified to fly a couple months earlier, and I'm the on-duty officer when the call comes in, PIW, PIW, you gotta go. And he said it was really emotional to have his first big rescue be in this superstorm, Sandy. But in retrospect, I kind of think that him being in that crash helped in this case, and I'll explain why in a minute. So when they get out there, again, the C-130 is such a big help in different ways, but one way is they can tell the helicopter exactly where to go, where the Bounty is, where life rafts are, because at night, trying to pick out a life raft or a strobe light in big seas is impossible. And even in the daytime is tough. Now, this slide is not from The Rescue of the Bounty. It's from my book, A Storm Too Soon. But Steve said, yeah, show this because it gives people an idea how hard it is to see even a life raft in a wave. And in A Storm Too Soon, the waves were a consistent 80 feet. So that's an 80-foot wave with a life raft like the size of a dime in it. And incredibly, people in that life raft did survive. Steve said, so when we got out there, the C-130 told us exactly where the Bounty was. They told us where the two rafts were. But they said, don't go to those. Go to one blinking strobe light a mile away, all on its own. We think there's somebody in it. And so that's where they went first. So Randy, it would have been at night, but the action would take place right here in the doorway of the helicopter because, you know, he's going to push out and Michael Lufkin's going to lower him down into the water. And the way normal rescues go is they unclip from the cable as soon as they hit the water so they can swim. Then they're going to get the first survivor. They're going to motion for the basket to be lowered. The basket is small. Just take one person. They'll stuff that person in, send them up, and then the rescue swimmer will come up last. Randy said, that's not how it went. I said, I didn't think so. And he said, it took me 6 tries to get to the raft. He said, I actually would have to call for the cable back and have them air taxi me, you know, swinging them through the air, getting them closer to the raft. And I said, why? And he said, Mike, the current and the waves were freaky. Those are his words. He said, usually, say you're at a beach and the wave comes and hits you, you know, pushes you along. He said, this was the opposite. The current's taking you this way. The wave's coming like this, and it buries you. And he said, by the time you come up, the next wave's almost there and buries you again. And he said it was the effect of the Gulf Stream. And sometimes I forget to mention this, but during his first attempt, the current's so strong it rips his mask and snorkel away. So imagine being out there at night and you don't even have anything to protect your eyes from the spray and the salt water. And he said on the 6th attempt, I finally made it. And that lone strobe light way off on its own had John Svensson in the survival suit. And I've never met John, but he's got to be one of the luckiest people on the planet. Because, you know, if the C-130 didn't say go there first, they would have rescued the people in the rafts. By the time they searched for him, he would have expired. He was injured. Even though the water temperature is probably around 70, you're still going to get hypothermic if you're out there long enough, even in a survival suit, especially if you're injured. But Randy said, I got him okay. After that 6th try, then we repositioned over one of the rafts. And he said, when I got down to the raft, the first thing I do is say, is anybody hurt? And I asked, do you say that to get that person medical attention up in the helicopter right away? He goes, Mike, that's got nothing to do with it. He said, I am the medical attention. I'm the EMT, and I can't do anything because I'm in the water. I said, so why do you take the person that's hurt? He said, you want the most difficult person to come up first when the rescue swimmer has the most energy. And I joked with him. I said, so I'm always fishing. If I find myself out on the ocean in a raft with my friends and I want out first, can I say I don't know how to swim? And he said, yes, we'll take you first because you'll be difficult to handle. So there's your tip of the day. Say you can't swim, and then if you ever take a cruise and you're on a big ship, always be on the stern. That floats longer than the bow. That's from The Finest Hours. So those are my only 2 practical tips of the evening. So he says, is anybody hurt? And nobody answers. So he just points to what he thinks is the oldest person, and it was, to Doug Font, and he says, you're going first. And Doug said, when I got up in the helicopter, you know, tears just streaming down my face, and I'd say I'd be the same. And he said, no, you don't understand. There were tears of relief because in the helicopter is John Svensson alive. And he said, I thought he went down with the ship because he was on the radio shouting for help when we all lurched over. So he couldn't believe there's John inside alive. And so, again, I'm using kind of Randy's words. He said, so I did the next rescue and the next and the next. And of the 6 people in the raft, I got 4 out. I had to be brought back up because the life raft had drifted so far. I'm getting ready to go again. And the hoist operator taps me on the shoulder, and he said, Commander Cerveni said, RTB, RTB, return to base. And Randy goes, no, 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 tell them there's still 2 people down there. I can't. And he tells them, and Steve goes, RTB, I don't care. We're up against bingo. That's their term for fuel. You know, we have just enough fuel to get safely back. And Steve goes, we are not pushing this in a hurricane, thinking of his own crash. And so Randy, being the rescue swimmer with the adrenaline, he's arguing with him, and Steve, finally tells him to shut up. And they head back. And Steve, rightly so, he tell the survivors, there will be another helicopter. We're not abandoning your friends. Although the 2 people left in the raft thought they were abandoned. They were thinking the worst. Did the helicopter crash? Did they forget about us and they're not coming back? So the next helicopter to launch had Dan Todd on the left. He's the rescue swimmer. Jenny Fields, co-pilot. Steve Bond, pilot. Neil Mulder, hoist operator. Again, I weave in their background. A lot of coincidences, like Steve Bond. I'm telling him about the other Steve. I said, boy, he was in a bad helicopter crash, and I started to tell him, and he goes, it's okay, I know. I go, yeah, he must have told you. He goes, no, I was the one who rescued him. He said it was the most difficult rescue, he said, because you're above timber in a hover in a snowstorm. And then another kind of funny story is Neil Mulder, the hoist operator on the right. I do my interview with him over the phone and thank him, and then a survivor says, ask that hoist operator why in the middle of the rescue he gets up off his belly, he's hanging out of the aircraft with the cable, and he runs right into a wall on purpose. So I immediately call him up and I go, hey, I heard you ran into a wall in the middle of the rescue. And he goes, oh, I forgot to tell you about that. And he goes, so I'm leaning out of the helicopter, a gust of wind takes the basket, and it pulled my arm right out of the socket, dislocated my shoulder. And he said, my swimmer's in the water, and I can't do my thing with one hand. And I said, well, what'd you do? And he said, well, that's when I ran into the wall to pop it back in place. And I'm like, you need to tell me these things in our interview. This is the kind of stuff you want in the book. But he was kind of typical of so many of them, of just like trying to tell you job by job, this is our job, here's what we do, and not really thinking like a writer would about what's dramatic and what's not. So out they go, and they do find the bounty. They're out there in daylight, and this is what they saw. Looks like a painting, doesn't it? He took that with his iPhone. And they thought there were crew members trapped in the rigging, so they did get way low. I'm talking like 50 feet. And they said, no, those red things were debris, or maybe empty survival suits. They said, we made sure there were no people hanging on to the rigging. And they said the C-130 then directed us to the life raft that had 7 people in it, the second life raft. And Dan said, I was really nervous. And he said, big time butterflies. And I said, why? And he said, well, you should be in these kind of things. But he also said, Randy, over the headset, while he's coming out, and Randy's coming back, warned me about the current. And he said, and Randy's way more experienced than me, and he said the way he was talking really made me like sit up and go, this is going to be unlike anything I've done. And he had the same trouble. When they lowered him and he comes off the hook. This is Dan being lowered. He could not get to the life raft, even though it was just 10 feet away. The current just took him away, and they had to keep air taxing him. And then in this photo, he finally makes it there, and he thinks the people might go into panic, so he goes, "Hey, I'm Dan, I hear you need a ride." And that's kind of his way, to calm them down. And he was later quoted by President Obama during Hurricane Sandy. But so he asks, he said, "I crawled into the life raft because I wanted to brief them. Here's how we're going to do it." And he said, as soon as I got in there, a wave hit, and he said it tacoed the life raft. So in other words, takes one end and folds it on top of the other, throwing all the people on top of each other. And he said, I'm in the middle of all this. And he said, I think I've already injured somebody. I haven't done a rescue. So he just shouts, forget the instructions. Who's hurt? And they all point to Adam. And there's President Obama quoting him. And look at that, Chris Christie, the strange bedfellows. Adam had been hurt earlier on the Bounty, again thrown into a bulkhead, had a broken collarbone, a big contusion on his head, and cracked vertebrae in his back. And he said, so when I found the life raft at first, it was too painful to go inside, so he said, I had one of those harnesses with the tether. He said, I just clipped to it. Well, you read in the book, that was a bad move. He said, because as I'm clipped to it, I'm drifting, I'm like 10 or 15 feet away. He said the safety line around the raft started to come apart. And he's going out to sea, and he screamed for his mates, pull me in, and they got him in time. And so he was the first one out. He said it was excruciating to be put in that little basket. And then so Dan repeats the process. And it's tough because you're taking them out of the raft, getting them in the basket, but when it comes time, now you got to go back to the raft. The raft is a bigger target for the wind, so it's drifted far away. So you're expending all this energy fighting your way back. And Dan said when there were just 2 people left in the raft, it was so light the whole thing flipped upside down. And he said, I thought for sure they were goners, because how would you find your way out of all that collapsed fabric? And I don't know what he's holding on to in this picture, but he said, it took me forever to get to the raft. And he said, when I did, there was, no shouts or anything. And he said, I really did think they were gone. He said, I went to the opposite side, and there were 2 people that got out and holding on. And he said, got those 2 up, and he said, by now, I've ingested so much seawater, I'm just struggling in place. I'm vomiting and just waiting and praying that they get that hook near me to get out of there. And so he comes up, and he said, the sound of the door shutting was the best sound in the world, and I'm safe too. And he said, but then the voice over the headphones was not so welcome. It was the pilot going, Dan, there's another raft that still has 2 people that Randy couldn't get. You have to do that one. And I said, what'd you say if you're vomiting your head off? He goes, what could I say? I said, I'll try. And he said, by then, he said, it's nothing like the movies. He said, I'm doing the dog paddle. He said, it's like swimming through mud. All the oxygen is out of your body. And he said, the good news was that first I'm doing it in daylight. Randy had to do it in the dark. But he said those last 2 people were young and in great shape, and they could get themselves, with just a little bit of help from me, into the basket. And then they shut the door. And he said, we took a last flight over the Bounty, and it was eerie. He said it had kind of righted itself, so much water in it. He said, we did one last look down low. There was nobody with it. And I said, did you know that you're still missing 2 people? He said, yeah, because we knew how many the first helicopter got, how many we had. We didn't know who they were because we didn't know who was on the first. But he said, we searched and couldn't find anybody else. A third helicopter came out later, and they did find Claudine, but she had expired. She was found a half-mile away in a survival suit, had a couple abrasions on her forehead, think she might have got hit by one of the rigging or the mast. That rescue swimmer, he was really torn up. He said, please put it in the book that we did CPR the whole flight back, but didn't work. And I said, what about Captain Robin Walbridge? He said, we searched and searched. He said another helicopter came out at twilight, searched. He said, we never found him. So it'll always be a mystery. Did he intentionally go down with the ship, or did he get tangled in the rigging? I don't think he was free of the ship, because he was in a survival suit. Survivors who saw him last said he was in a survival suit and was crawling aft just like Claudine was. So I think if he was in a survival suit, eventually the Coast Guard would have found him, doing those bigger and bigger rings, because it's buoyant. So either went down with the ship on purpose or got tangled in the rigging. And so back at the base, see what I meant about the water and the legs? That almost killed them all. And it was funny, when Doug and I talked about doing the book, first I said, I'm not sure I want to. It's such a sad story. And he said, well, just make one call to the rescue swimmer and to West McIntosh on the C-130, and you'll realize that it's a whole different story. He said, just make that call. So I did, and then I called him back. I said, I know what you mean. They're lucky they got anybody, because in the research I realized everything had to go just right in the decisions of these relatively young crews. The two helicopter crews had to be spot on, and the rescuers had to not panic and work together. You'd never have the 14 saved. So in the end, it was really uplifting, especially from the Coast Guard's perspective of how we did this and how it all worked. Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.